I would like to tell you a story. There is a neighborhood that is governed by a homeowners association. This HOA has a rule. No permanent structures can be added to a house without prior approval. Makes sense, doesn't it? You don't want shoddy workmanship to cause injuries or become an eyesore that lowers everyone's property values. There is an old woman who lives in one of these houses. She recently had to start using a wheelchair. She is also poor, depending only on a monthly Social Security check to live. The problem is that her house wasn't built to accommodate a wheelchair. On her own, she cannot leave her own house. Unless she has help, she is trapped in a kind of jail. She needs a wheelchair ramp to be able to exit her house. However, due to her impoverished state, she cannot hire a licensed contractor. A neighbor of hers, a carpenter, is talking to her one day, and she confesses her problem. The neighbor decides to help out. He uses his own materials and builds her a wheelchair ramp for free. The HOA discovers this ramp. The HOA isn't pleased. The HOA fines this old wheelchair-bound woman several $1,000s for having an unapproved structure attached to her house. Not only that, but they demand that she tear the ramp down. This isn't some made-up story to provide a straw man argument. This story actually happened. So, the rules have been enforced. The HOA applies its standards equally throughout the neighborhood. They don't make exceptions. So the question I want to explore today is enforcing this rule by the HOA unethical? Not illegal, not acting out of malice, just unethical. This episode is going to talk about what happens when ethics is taken from the personal and is placed inside of an institution. I'm going to use the HOA as an example, but the question of ethics can reside in any institution: schools, businesses, governments. Institutional ethics can be called variously rules, code of conduct, policies, or procedures. They all boil down to one thing: enforcement mechanisms. On the surface, these enforcement mechanisms are meant to address the central concept of ethics: reduction of harm. They're arrived at through a process of reasoned judgment. On the surface, they can seem quite ethical. So, what happens to ethics when it tries to scale from the personal to the institutional? As I've said before on this channel, I am using a very specific definition of ethics. Ethics is not obedience to authority. It's not blind compliance with rules. It doesn't rely on tradition. Ethics is personal responsibility to others. Ethics requires judgment. It requires context. It requires asking sometimes very difficult questions. Who is harmed? How can harm be repaired? What is my responsibility in this situation? Those questions can be very hard for individuals to answer. When groups try to do it, things can get complicated very quickly. Let's take the viewpoint of institutions for a moment. Institutions want codes of ethics for good reasons. It provides a consistent set of principles and remedies when infractions occur. They play no favorites. It is predictable. It reduces individual bias. The HOA doesn't want to re-examine their rules for each case. They want something in black and white that says, if this happens, then that remedy is the result. A company doesn't want employees to act individually in each circumstance, creating ethical solutions on the fly. A profession wants shared standards. After all, you don't want your personal physician to replace the Hippocratic Oath with something they improvised by themselves. So ethics gets translated into an oath, a handbook, or guidelines, or at the very least, a checklist. This is understandable, not just for the people writing and enforcing these rules, but for people who depend on those rules in order to give their trust. Imagine going to a lawyer and not knowing if he will keep your confidence. The code of ethics shared by all lawyers is there so that the legal system can function at a fundamental level. But something subtle happens when ethics becomes institutional. When a system of rules, however ethically derived, is put in place, judgment is no longer required. Nuance and context are lost. And when judgment no longer exists and context is irrelevant, the question no longer gets asked. What is the ethical thing to do here? Instead, it is replaced by the question, what does the rule book say? Well, the rule book was arrived at through thoughtful, reasoned discussion. It addresses harm. So going by the rule book should be ethical, right? Let's go back to the ramp. The HOA can say, we enforce these rules evenly. If we make exception, then fairness collapses. Our job is not to judge individual circumstances. And here's the uncomfortable truth. They could be right on all counts. But the outcome can still be unethical. How? Because no one at the HOA is taking responsibility for the harm. All of those statements are made to obscure the fact that the rulebook is taking over for personal judgment. The woman in the wheelchair is fined. Her home becomes a prison. And the justification for that is procedural, not ethical. This is why ethics fails at scale. Ethics is replaced by a series of enforcement mechanisms. When the gears of the enforcement mechanism start to turn, harm becomes incidental, context becomes irrelevant, responsibility becomes abstract. Everyone involved can sit back and comfortably say, I did my part. The rules were applied fairly, without prejudice, and the result is expected. When that old woman signed her HOA contract, she was made aware of the rules. She wasn't blindsided, so the HOA can be satisfied that their ethically derived rules served their purpose. We're not making a value judgment, they say. We're just enforcing the rule. And yet, an ethical failure remains. Ethics cannot be neutral. Where harm is involved, ethics at least presents a responsibility to act or not to act. And if you act, what is the mechanism of repair for that harm? In the HOA case, they didn't just enforce a rule. They made a choice that actively harmed someone. They chose not to weigh the consequences of their enforcement. That choice matters. This is why so many codes of conduct disappoint. They describe ideals. They prohibit egregious behavior. They outline expectations. All good, right? But what they so often fail to do is know when to suspend enforcement, know when harm outweighs the need for consistency, know when compassion demands leniency. Once you take all of these into account, you come to a rather startling and dangerous conclusion. Ethics cannot be automated. It must constantly be monitored, reevaluated, and judged on a case-by-case basis. Can institutions take on the burden of this churn of events and evaluations? Some try to achieve this by having an appeals process or a neutral arbiter. These attempt to provide individual attention to edge cases and are empowered to correct for the inevitable flaws that arise when black and white meets true to life. Why didn't this HOA have such ethical protections? Why was the old woman simply penalized instead of being offered a chance to state her case? Honestly, it's because that HOA, and many others besides, wasn't interested in ethics, only the facade of ethics. But even if the institution has an appeals process, certainly one of the arguments they'll make in such proceedings is, if we make this exception, it'll be unfair to others. This is the great ethical trap that institutions often fall into. Fairness and ethics are not the same thing. Treating unlike cases equally can be procedurally fair but ethically wrong. Ethics doesn't require sameness. Every situation is different. What ethics demands is responsibility. But with codified enforcement mechanisms, responsibility no longer resides in the witness to harm. It's deferred to the authorities who crafted the institution's code of conduct. It's an appeal to authority, which treads dangerously close to moralistic territory. Listen, ethics doesn't scale easily. If an institution wants to act ethically, it must allow for discretion, tolerate inconsistency, empower judgment, and accept risk. That's very uncomfortable for institutions. It feels dangerous and subjective. There's no longer a rule book to point frantically at when real consequences start to happen. But the alternative is worse. The alternative is apathy and disregard for harm. This is why institutions must have a method of appeal, or it'll fall prey to moralism. It'll fail the people it's trying to protect. So, does the HOA become unethical in this scenario? Not because it has rules, not because it enforces them. It becomes unethical because it refuses to account for the foreseeable harm. It substitutes procedure for responsibility. It treats enforcement as an end goal rather than repair of the harm. This story about the woman in the wheelchair and her helpful neighbor has a happy ending. You see, the woman took the HOA to court to repeal the fine and to keep her new ramp. The presiding judge, after hearing both sides of the case, took the woman's side. The fine was voided. She got to keep her ramp. In this instance, it took a single person to see the harm in the HOA's actions. The judge acted ethically when the HOA would not. The HOA should never have let it get that far. They should have had a mechanism for dealing with cases like this. It never should have gone to court. And it must be said that the positive outcome for this old woman is not necessarily typical of our judicial system. Oftentimes, the enforcement mechanisms are upheld by the judge, because judges can be unethical too. Ethics is fragile. It survives through judgment, not rules. Through people willing to say, the rules do not absolve me of my responsibility to others. When ethics scales, it does not become stronger, it becomes brittle. People within the institution must fight hard to actively protect it. And that protection is uncomfortable, messy, and risky. But without people willing to truly examine the rules they are called upon to enforce, to truly apply their own judgment to each situation, ethics vanishes.